He peered with fearful trepidation at the supposed demons, and began to mumble a prayer to the god who had abandoned him so inexplicably to his spiritual foes. Then he remembered the necromantic powers of Azédarac, and conceived another surmise, that he had been spirited bodily away from the Inn of Bonne Jouissance, and delivered into the hands of those pre-satanic entities that served the sorceress bishop. Becoming convinced of his own physical solidity and integrity, and reflecting that such was scarcely the appropriate condition of a disincarnate soul, and also that the sylvan scene about him was hardly characteristic of the infernal regions, he accepted this as the true explanation. He was still alive, and still on earth, though the circumstances of his situation were more than mysterious, and were fraught with dire, unknowable danger. The strange beings had maintained an utter silence, as if they were too dumbfounded for speech. Hearing the prayerful murmurs of Ambrose, they seemed to recover from their surprise, and became not only articulate, but vociferous. Ambrose could make nothing of their harsh vocables, in which sibilants and aspirates and gutturals were often combined in a manner difficult for the normal human tongue to imitate. However, he caught the word taranit, several times repeated, and wondered if it were the name of an especially malevolent demon. The speech of the weird beings began to assume a sort of rude rhythm, like the intonations of some primordial chant. Two of them stepped forward and seized Ambrose, while the voices of their companions rose in a shrill, triumphant litany. Scarcely knowing what had happened, and still less what was to follow, Ambrose was flung supine on the granite block and was held down by one of his captors, while the other raised aloft the keen blade of chiseled flint which he carried. The blade was poised in air above Ambrose's heart, and the monk realized in sudden terror that it would fall with dire velocity and pierce him through before the lapse of another moment. Then, above the demoniac chanting which had risen to a mad, malignant frenzy, he heard the sweet and imperious cry of a woman's voice. In the wild confusion of his terror, the words were strange and meaningless to him. But plainly they were understood by his captors, and were taken as an undeniable command. The stone knife was lowered sullenly, and Ambrose was permitted to resume a sitting posture on the flat slab. His rescuer was standing on the edge of the open glade, in the wide-flung umbrage of an ancient pine. She came forward now, and the white-garmented beings fell back with evident respect before her. She was very tall, with a fearless and regal demeanor, and was gowned in a dark, shimmering blue, like the star-laden blue of nocturnal summer skies. Her hair was knotted in a long golden-brown braid, heavy as the glistening coils of some eastern serpent. Her eyes were a strange amber, her lips a vermilion touched with the coolness of woodland shadow, and her skin was of alabastrine fairness. Ambrose saw that she was beautiful, but she inspired him with the same awe that he would have felt before a queen, together with something of the fear and consternation which a virtuous young monk would conceive in the perilous presence of an alluring succubus. "Come with me," she said to Ambrose, in a tongue that his monastic studies enabled him to recognize as an obsolete variant of the French of Averoigne, a tongue that no man had supposedly spoken for many 100 years. Obediently and in great wonder, he arose and followed her, with no hindrance from his glowering and reluctant captors. The woman led him to a narrow path that wound sinuously away through the deep forest. In a few moments, the glade, the granite block, and the cluster of white-robed men were lost to sight behind the heavy foliage. "Who are you?" asked the lady, turning to Ambrose. "You look like one of those crazy missionaries who are beginning to enter Averoigne nowadays. I believe that people call them Christians. The Druids have sacrificed so many of them to Taranit that I marvel at your temerity in coming here." Ambrose found it difficult to comprehend the archaic phrasing, and the import of her words was so utterly strange and baffling that he felt sure he must have misunderstood her. "I am Brother Ambrose," he replied, expressing himself slowly and awkwardly in the long disused dialect. "Of course I am a Christian, but I confess that I fail to understand you. I have heard of the pagan druids, but surely they were all driven from Averoigne many centuries ago." The woman stared at Ambrose with open amazement and pity. Her brownish-yellow eyes were bright and clear as a mellowed wine. "Poor little one," she said. "I fear that your dreadful experiences have served to unsettle you. It was fortunate that I came along when I did, and decided to intervene. I seldom interfere with the druids and their sacrifices, but I saw you sitting on their altar a little while agone, and was struck by your youth and comeliness." Ambrose felt more and more that he had been made the victim of a most peculiar sorcery, but even yet he was far from suspecting the true magnitude of this sorcery. Amid his bemusement and consternation, however, he realized that he owed his life to the singular and lovely woman beside him, and began to stammer out his gratitude. "You need not thank me," said the lady with a dulcet smile. "I am Moriamis, the Enchantress, and the druids fear my magic, which is more sovereign and more excellent than theirs, though I use it only for the welfare of men, and not for their bale or bane." The monk was dismayed to learn that his fair rescuer was a sorceress, even though her powers were professedly benignant. The knowledge added to his alarm, but he felt that it would be politic to conceal his emotions in this regard. "Indeed, I am grateful to you," he protested. "And now, if you can tell me the way to the inn of Bonne Jouissance, which I left not long ago, I shall owe you a further debt." Moriamis knitted her light brows. "I have never heard of the inn of Bonne Jouissance. There is no such place in this region." "But this is the forest of Averoigne, is it not?" inquired the puzzled Ambrose. "And surely we are not far from the road that runs between the town of Hemus and the city of Viones." "I have never heard of Hemus, or Viones either," said Moriamis. "Truly, the land is known as Averoigne, and this forest is the great wood of Averoigne, which men have called by that name from primeval years. But there are no towns such as the ones whereof you speak, Brother Ambrose. I fear that you still wander a little in your mind." Ambrose was aware of a maddening perplexity. "I have been most damnably beguiled," he said, half to himself. "It is all the doing of that abominable sorcerer, Azédarac, I am sure." The woman started as if she had been stung by a wild bee. There was something both eager and severe in the searching gaze that she turned upon Ambrose. "Azédarac?" she queried. "What do you know of Azédarac? I was once acquainted with someone by that name, and I wonder if it could be the same person. Is he tall and a little gray, with hot, dark eyes, and a proud, half-angry air, and a crescent scar on the brow?" Greatly mystified, and more troubled than ever, Ambrose admitted the veracity of her description. Realizing that in some unknown way he had stumbled upon the hidden antecedents of the sorcerer, he confided the story of his adventures to Moriamis, hoping that she would reciprocate with further information concerning Azédarac. The woman listened with the air of one who is much interested but not at all surprised. "I understand now," she observed, when he had finished. "Anon I shall explain everything that mystifies and troubles you. I think I know this Jehan Mauvaissoir also. He has long been the manservant of Azédarac, though his name was Melcher in other days. These two have always been the underlings of evil, and have served the old ones in ways forgotten or never known by the druids. Indeed, I hope you can explain what has happened," said Ambrose. "It is a fearsome and strange and ungodly thing to drink a draught of wine in a tavern at eventide, and then find oneself in the heart of the forest by afternoon daylight, among demons such as those from whom you succored me." "Yea," countered Moriamis, "it is even stranger than you dream. Tell me, Brother Ambrose, what was the year in which you entered the inn of Bonne Jouissance?" "Why, it is the year of our Lord, 1175, of course. What other year could it be?" "The Druids use a different chronology," replied Moriamis, "and their notation would mean nothing to you. But, according to that which the Christian missionaries would now introduce in Averoigne, the present year is 475 AD. You have been sent back no less than 700 years into what the people of your era would regard as the past. The Druid altar on which I found you lying is probably located on the future site of the Inn of Bonne Jouissance." Ambrose was more than dumbfounded. His mind was unable to grasp the entire import of Moriamis's words. "But how can such things be?" he cried. "How can a man go backward in time, among years and people that have long turned to dust?" "That, mayhap, is a mystery for Azédarac to unriddle. However, the past and the future coexist with what we call the present, and are merely the two segments of the circle of time. We see them and name them according to our own position in the circle." Ambrose felt that he had fallen among necromancies of a most unhallowed and unexampled sort, and had been made the victim of diableries unknown to the Christian catalogues. Tongue-tied by a consciousness that all comment, all protest or even prayer would prove inadequate to the situation, he saw that a stone tower with small, lozenge-shaped windows was now visible above the turrets of pine along the path which he and Moriamis were following. "This is my home," said Moriamis, as they came forth from beneath the thinning trees at the foot of a little knoll on which the tower was situated. "Brother Ambrose, you must be my guest." Ambrose was unable to decline the proffered hospitality, in spite of his feeling that Moriamis was hardly the most suitable of chatelaines for a chaste and God-fearing monk. However, the pious misgivings with which she inspired him were not unmingled with fascination. Also, like a lost child, he clung to the only available protection in a land of fearful perils and astounding mysteries. The interior of the tower was neat and clean and homelike, though with furniture of a ruder sort than that to which Ambrose was accustomed, and rich but roughly woven arrases. A serving woman, tall as Moriamis herself, but darker, brought to him a huge bowl of milk and wheaten bread, and the monk was now able to assuage the hunger that had gone unsatisfied in the Inn of Bonne Jouissance. As he seated himself before the simple fare, he realized that the Book of Ibon was still heavy in the bosom of his gown. He removed the volume and gave it gingerly to Moriamis. Her eyes widened, but she made no comment until he had finished his meal. Then she said, "This volume is indeed the property of Azédarac, who was formerly a neighbor of mine. I knew the scoundrel quite well. In fact, I knew him all too well." Her bosom heaved with an obscure emotion as she paused for a moment. "He was the wisest and the mightiest of sorcerers, and the most secret withal. For no one knew the time and the manner of his coming into Averoigne, or the fashion in which he had procured the immemorial Book of Ibon, whose runic writings were beyond the lore of all other wizards. He was master of all enchantments and all demons, and likewise a compounder of mighty potions. Among these were certain philters, blended with potent spells, and possessed of unique virtue, that would send the drinker backward or forward in time. One of them, I believe, was administered to you by Melchior, or Jehan Mauvaissois, and Azédarac himself, together with this manservant, made use of another, perhaps not for the first time, when they went onward from the present age of the Druids into that age of Christian authority to which you belong. There was a blood-red vial for the past, and a green for the future. Behold, I possess one of each, though Azédarac was unaware that I knew of their existence." She opened a little cupboard, in which were the various charms and medicaments, the sun-dried herbs and moon-compounded essences that a sorceress would employ. From among them she brought out the two vials, one of which contained a sanguine-colored liquid, and the other a fluid of emerald brightness. "I stole them one day, out of womanly curiosity, from his hidden store of philters and elixirs and magistrals," continued Moriamis. I could have followed the rascal when he disappeared into the future, if I had chosen to do so. But I am well enough content with my own age. And moreover, I am not the sort of woman who pursues a wearied and reluctant lover." "Then," said Ambrose, more bewildered than ever, but hopeful, "if I were to drink the contents of the green vial, I should return to my own epoch." "Precisely. And I am sure, from what you have told me, that your return would be a source of much annoyance to Azédarac. It is like the fellow to have established himself in a fat prelacy. He was ever the master of circumstance, with an eye to his own accommodation and comfort. It would hardly please him, I am sure, if you were to reach the Archbishop. I am not revengeful by nature, but on the other hand, it is hard to understand how anyone could have wearied of you," said Ambrose gallantly, as he began to comprehend the situation. Moriamis smiled. "That is prettily said. And you are really a charming youth, in spite of that dismal-looking robe. I am glad that I rescued you from the Druids, who would have torn your heart out and offered it to their demon Taranit." "And now you will send me back?" Moriamis frowned a little, and then assumed her most seductive air. "Are you in such a hurry to leave your hostess? Now that you are living in another century than your own, a day, a week, or a month will make no difference in the date of your return. I have also retained the formulas of Azédarac, and I know how to graduate the potion if necessary. The usual period of transportation in time is exactly 700 years, but the filter can be strengthened or weakened a little." The sun had fallen beyond the pines, and a soft twilight was beginning to invade the tower. The maidservant had left the room. Moriamis came over and seated herself beside Ambrose on the rough bench he was occupying. Still smiling, she fixed her amber eyes upon him, with a languid flame in their depths, a flame that seemed to brighten as the dusk grew stronger. Without speaking, she began slowly to unbraid her heavy hair, from which there emanated a perfume that was subtle and delicious as the perfume of grape flowers. Ambrose was embarrassed by this delightful proximity. "I am not sure that it would be right for me to remain, after all. What would the Archbishop think?" "My dear child, the Archbishop will not even be born for at least 650 years, and it will be still longer before you are born. And when you return, anything that you have done during your stay with me will have happened no less than 7 centuries ago, which should be long enough to procure the remission of any sin, no matter how often repeated." Like a man who has been taken in the toils of some fantastic dream and finds that the dream is not altogether disagreeable, Ambrose yielded to this feminine and irrefutable reasoning. He hardly knew what was to happen, but, under the exceptional circumstances indicated by Moriamis, the rigors of monastic discipline might well be relaxed to almost any conceivable degree, without entailing spiritual perdition or even a serious breach of vows. Chapter 4. A month later, Moriamis and Ambrose were standing beside the Druid altar. It was late in the evening, and a slightly gibbous moon had risen upon the deserted glade and was fringing the treetops with wefted silver. The warm breath of the summer night was gentle as the sighing of a woman in slumber. "Must you go, after all?" said Moriamis, in a pleading and regretful voice. "It is my duty. I must return to Clement with the Book of Ibon and the other evidence I have collected against Azédarac." The words sounded a little unreal to Ambrose as he uttered them, and he tried very hard but vainly to convince himself of the cogency and validity of his arguments. The idyll of his stay with Moriamis, to which he was oddly unable to attach any true conviction of sin, had given to all that preceded it a certain dismal insubstantiality. Free from all responsibility or restraint, in the sheer obliviousness of dreams, he had lived like a happy pagan, and now he must go back to the drear existence of a medieval monk, beneath the prompting of an obscure sense of duty. "I shall not try to hold you," Moriamis sighed, "but I shall miss you, and remember you as a worthy lover and a pleasant playmate." Here is the filter." The green essence was cold and almost hueless in the moonlight, as Moriamis poured it into a little cup and gave it to Ambrose. "Are you sure of its precise efficacy?" the monk inquired. "Are you sure that I shall return to the Inn of Bonne Jouissance at a time not far subsequent to that of my departure therefrom?" "Yea," said Moriamis, "for the potion is infallible. But stay. I have also brought along the other vial, the vial of the past. Take it with you, for who knows, you may sometime wish to return and visit me again." Ambrose accepted the red vial and placed it in his robe beside the ancient manual of Hyperborean sorcery. Then, after an appropriate farewell to Moriamis, he drained with sudden resolution the contents of the cup. The moonlit glade, the grey altar, and Moriamis, all vanished in a swirl of flame and shadow. It seemed to Ambrose that he was soaring endlessly through phantasmagoric gulfs amid the ceaseless shifting and melting of unstable things, the transient forming and fading of irresoluble worlds. At the end, he found himself sitting once more in the Inn of Bonne Jouissance, at what he assumed to be the very same table before which he had sat with the Sieur des Émaux. It was daylight, and the room was full of people, among whom he looked in vain for the rubicund face of the innkeeper, or the servants and fellow guests he had previously seen. All were unfamiliar to him, and the furniture was strangely worn, and was grimier than he remembered it. Perceiving the presence of Ambrose, the people began to eye him with open curiosity and wonderment. A tall man with dolorous eyes and lantern jaws came hastily forward, and bowed before him with an air that was half servile, but full of a prying impertinence. "What do you wish?" he asked. "Is this the Inn of Bonne Jouissance?" The innkeeper stared at Ambrose. "Nay, it is the Inn of Haute Espérance, of which I have been the taverner these 30 years. Could you not read the sign? It was called the Inn of Bonne Jouissance in my father's time, but the name was changed after his death." Ambrose was filled with consternation. "But the inn was differently named, and was kept by another man when I visited it not long ago," he cried in his bewilderment. "The owner was a stout, jovial man, not in the least like you." "That would answer the description of my father," said the taverner, eyeing Ambrose more dubiously than ever. "He has been dead for the full 30 years of which I speak, and surely you were not even born at the time of his decease." Ambrose began to realize what had happened. The emerald potion, by some error or excess of potency, had taken him many years beyond his own time into the future. "I must resume my journey to Vions," he said in a bewildered voice, without fully comprehending the implications of his situation. "I have a message for the Archbishop Clement, and must not delay longer in delivering it." "But Clement has been dead even longer than my father," exclaimed the innkeeper. "From whence do you come, that you are ignorant of this?" It was plain from his manner that he had begun to doubt the sanity of Ambrose. Others, overhearing the strange discussion, had begun to crowd about, and were plying the monk with jocular and sometimes ribald questions. "And what of Azédarac, the Bishop of Hymes? Is he dead too?" inquired Ambrose desperately. "You mean Saint Azédarac, no doubt. He outlived Clement, but nevertheless he has been dead and duly canonized for 32 years. Some say that he did not die, but was transported to heaven alive, and that his body was never buried in the great mausoleum reared for him at Hymes. But that is probably a mere legend." Ambrose was overwhelmed with unspeakable desolation and confusion. In the meanwhile, the crowd about him had increased, and in spite of his robe, he was being made the subject of rude remarks and jeers. "The good brother has lost his wits," cried some. "The wines of Averoigne are too strong for him," said others. "What year is this?" demanded Ambrose in his desperation. "The year of our Lord, 1230, replied the taverner, breaking into a derisive laugh. "And what year did you think it was?" "It was the year 1175 when I last visited the Inn of Bonne Jouissance," admitted Ambrose. His declaration was greeted with fresh jeers and laughter. "Hola, young sir, you were not even conceived at that time," the taverner said. Then, seeming to remember something, he went on in a more thoughtful tone. "When I was a child, my father told me of a young monk, about your age, who came to the Inn of Bonne Jouissance one evening in the summer of 1175, and vanished inexplicably after drinking a draught of red wine. I believe his name was Ambrose. Perhaps you are Ambrose, and have only just returned from a visit to nowhere." He gave a derisory wink, and the new jest was taken up and bandied from mouth to mouth among the frequenters of the tavern. Ambrose was trying to realize the full import of his predicament. His mission was now useless, through the death or disappearance of Azédarac, and no one would remain in all Averoigne to recognize him or believe his story. He felt the hopelessness of his alienation among unknown years and people. Suddenly, he remembered the red vial given him at parting by Moriamis. The potion, like the green filter, might prove uncertain in its effect, but he was seized by an all-consuming desire to escape from the weird embarrassment and wilderment of his present position. Also, he longed for Moriamis, like a lost child for its mother, and the charm of his sojourn in the past was upon him with an irresistible spell. Ignoring the ribald faces and voices about him, he drew the vial from his bosom, uncorked it, and swallowed the contents. Chapter 5. He was back in the forest glade by the gigantic altar. Moriamis was beside him again, lovely and warm and breathing, and the moon was still rising above the pine tops. It seemed that no more than a few moments could have elapsed since he had said farewell to the beloved Enchantress. "I thought you might return," said Moriamis, "and I waited a little while." Ambrose told her of the singular mishap that had attended his journey in time. Moriamis nodded gravely. "The green filter was more potent than I had supposed," she remarked. "It is fortunate, though, that the red filter was equivalently strong, and could bring you back to me through all those added years. You will have to remain with me now, for I possessed only the 2 vials. I hope you are not sorry." Ambrose proceeded to prove, in a somewhat unmonastic manner, that her hope was fully justified. Neither then nor at any other time did Moriamis tell him that she herself had strengthened slightly and equally the 2 filters by means of the private formula which she had also stolen from Azédarac. A night in Malnéant. My sojourn in the city of Malnéant occurred during a period of my life no less dim and dubious than that city itself and the misty regions lying thereabout. I have no precise recollection of its locality, nor can I remember exactly when and how I came to visit it. But I had heard vaguely that such a place was situated along my route, and when I came to the fog-enfolded river that flows beside its walls, and heard beyond the river the mortuary tolling of many bells, I surmised that I was approaching Malnéant. On reaching the grey, colossal bridge that crosses the river, I could have continued at will on other roads leading to remoter cities. But it seemed to me that I might as well enter Malnéant as any other place. And so it was that I set foot on the bridge of shadowy arches, under which the black waters flowed in stealthy division and were joined again in a silence as of Styx and Acheron. That period of my life, I have said, was dim and dubious, all the more so, mayhap, because of my need for forgetfulness, my persistent and at times partially rewarded search for oblivion. And that which I needed to forget above all was the death of the Lady Mariel, and the fact that I myself had slain her as surely as if I had done the deed with my own hand. For she had loved me with an affection deeper and purer and more stable than mine. And my changeable temper, my fits of cruel indifference or ferocious irritability, had broken her gentle heart. So it was that she had sought the anodyne of a lethal poison, and after she was laid to rest in the somber vaults of her ancestors, I had become a wanderer, followed and forever tortured by a belated remorse. For months or years, I am uncertain which, I roamed from old-world city to city, heeding little where I went if only wine and the other agents of oblivion were available. And thus I came, some while in my indefinite journeying, to the dim environs of Malnéant. The sun, if ever there was a sun above this region, had been lost for I knew not how long in a sky of leaden vapors. The day was drear and sullen at best. But now, by the thickening of the shadows and the mist, I felt that evening must be near, and the bells I had heard, however heavy and sepulchral their tolling, gave at least the assurance of prospective shelter for the night. So I crossed the long bridge and entered the grimly yawning gate with a quickening of my footsteps, even if with no alacrity of spirit. The dusk had gathered behind the grey walls, but there were few lights in the city. Few people were abroad, and these went upon their way with a sort of solemn haste, as if on some funereal errand that would admit of no delay. The streets were narrow, the houses high, with overhanging balconies and heavily curtained or shuttered windows. All was very silent, except for the bells, which tolled recurrently, sometimes faint and far off, and sometimes with a loud and startling clangor that seemed to come almost from overhead. As I plunged among the shadowy mansions, along the streets from which a visible twilight issued to envelop me, it seemed that I was going farther and farther away from my memories at every step. For this reason, I did not at once inquire my way to a tavern, but was content to lose myself more and more in the grey labyrinth of buildings, which grew vaguer and vaguer amid the ever-mounting darkness and fog, as if they were about to dissolve in oblivion. I think that my soul would have been almost at peace with itself, if it had not been for the reiterant ringing of the bells, which were like all bells that toll for the repose of the dead, and therefore set me to remembering those that had rung for Marielle. But whenever they ceased, my thoughts would drift back with an indolent ease, a recovered security, to the all-surrounding vagueness. I had no idea how far I had gone in Malnéant, nor how long I had roamed among those houses that hardly seemed as if they could be peopled by any but the sleeping or the dead. At last, however, I became aware that I was very tired, and bethought me of food and wine and a lodging for the night. But nowhere in my wanderings had I noticed the signboard of an inn, so I resolved to ask the next passer-by for the desired direction. As I have said before, there were few people abroad. Now, when I made up my mind to address one of them, it appeared that there was no one at all, and I walked onward through street after street in my futile search for a living face. At length I met two women, clothed in grey that was cold and dim as the folds of the fog, and veiled withal, who were hurrying along with the same funereal intentness I had perceived in all other denizens of that city. I made bold to accost them, asking if they could direct me to an inn. Scarcely pausing or even turning their heads, they answered, "We cannot tell you. We are shroud weavers, and we have been busy making a shroud for the Lady Marielle." Now, at that name, which of all names in the world was the one I should least have expected or cared to hear, an unspeakable chill invaded my heart, and a dreadful dismay smote me like the breath of the tomb. It was indeed strange that in this dim city, so far in time and space from all I had fled to escape, a woman should have recently died who was also named Marielle. The coincidence appeared so sinister that an odd fear of the streets through which I had wandered was born suddenly in my soul. The name had evoked, with a more irrevocable fatality than the tolling of the bells, all that I had vainly wished to forget, and my memories were like living coals in my heart. As I went onward, with paces that had become more hurried, more feverish than those of the people of Malnéant. I met two men, who likewise dressed from head to foot in grey, and I asked of them the same question I had asked of the shroud weavers. "We cannot tell you," they replied. "We are coffin makers, and we have been busy making a coffin for the Lady Marielle." As they spoke and hastened on, the bells rang out again, this time very near at hand, with a more dismal and sepulchral menace in their leaden tolling. And everything about me, the tall and misty houses, the dark, indefinite streets, the rare and wraith-like figures, became as if part of the obscure confusion and fear and bafflement of a nightmare. Moment by moment, the coincidence on which I had stumbled appeared all too bizarre for belief, and I was troubled now by the monstrous and absurd idea that the Marielle I knew had only just died, and that this fantastic city was in some unsurmisable manner connected with her death. But this, of course, my reason rejected summarily, and I kept repeating to myself, "The Marielle of whom they speak is another Marl." And it irritated me beyond all measure that a thought so enormous and ludicrous should return when my logic had dismissed it. I met no more people of whom to inquire my way. But at length, as I fought with my shadowy perplexity and my burning memories, I found that I had paused beneath the weather-beaten sign of an inn, on which the lettering had been half effaced by time and the brown lichens. The building was obviously very old, like all the houses in Malnéant. Its upper stories were lost in the swirling fog, except for a few furtive lights that glowed obscurely down, and a vague and musty odor of antiquity came forth to greet me as I mounted the steps and tried to open the ponderous door. But the door had been locked or bolted, so I began to pound upon it with my fists to attract the attention of those within. After much delay, the door was opened slowly and grudgingly, and a cadaverous-looking individual peered forth, frowning with portentous gravity as he saw me. "What do you desire?" he queried, in tones that were both brusque and solemn. "A room for the night, and wine," I requested. "We cannot accommodate you. All the rooms are occupied by people who have come to attend the obsequies of the Lady Marielle, and all the wine in the house has been requisitioned for their use. You will have to go elsewhere." He closed the door quickly upon me with the last words. I turned to resume my wanderings, and all that had troubled me before was now intensified 100-fold. The grey mists and the greyer houses were full of the menace of memory. They were like traitorous tombs from which the cadavers of dead hours poured forth to assail me with envenomed fangs and talons. I cursed the hour when I had entered Malnéant, for it seemed to me now that in so doing I had merely completed a funereal, sinister circle through time, and had returned to the day of Marielle's death. And certainly all my recollections of Marielle, of her final agony and her entombment, had assumed the frightful vitality of present things. But my reason still maintained, of course, that the Marielle who lay dead somewhere in Malnéant, and for whom all these obsequy preparations were being made, was not the lady whom I had loved, but another. After threading streets that were even darker and narrower than those before traversed, I found a second inn, bearing a similar weather-beaten sign, and in all other respects very much like the first. The door was barred, and I knocked thereon with trepidation, and was in no manner surprised when a second individual with a cadaverous face informed me in tones of sepulchral solemnity, "We cannot accommodate you. All the rooms have been taken by musicians and mourners who will serve at the obsequies of the Lady Marielle, and all the wine has been reserved for their use." Now I began to dread the city about me with a manifold fear, for apparently the whole business of the people in Malnéant consisted of preparations for the funeral of this Lady Marielle, and it began to be obvious that I must walk the streets of the city all night because of these same preparations. All at once, an overwhelming weariness was mingled with my nightmare terror and perplexity. I had not long continued my peregrinations after leaving the second inn, when the bells were tolled once more. For the first time, I found it possible to identify their source. They were in the spires of a great cathedral, which loomed immediately before me through the fog. Some people were entering the cathedral, and a curiosity, which I knew to be both morbid and perilous, prompted me to follow them. Here, I somehow felt, I should be able to learn more regarding the mystery that tormented me. All was dim within, and the light of many tapers scarcely served to illumine the vast nave and altar. Masses were being said by priests in black whose faces I could not see distinctly, and to me their chanting was like words in a dream, and I could hear nothing, and nothing was plainly visible in all the place, except a bier of opulent fabrics on which there lay a motionless form in white. Flowers of many hues had been strewn upon the bier, and their fragrance filled the air with a drowsy languor, with an anodyne that seemed to drug my heart and brain. Such flowers had been cast on the bier of Marielle, and even thus, at her funeral, I had been overcome by a momentary dulling of the senses because of their perfume. Dimly I became aware that someone was at my elbow. With eyes still intent on the bier, I asked, "Who is it that lies yonder, for whom these masses are being said, and these bells are rung?" And a slow, sepulchral voice replied, "It is the Lady Marielle, who died yesterday, and who will be interred tomorrow in the vaults of her ancestors. If you wish, you may go forward and gaze upon her." So I went down the cathedral aisle, even to the side of the bier, whose opulent fabrics trailed on the cold flags. And the face of her who lay thereon, with a tranquil smile upon the lips and tender shadows upon the shut eyelids, was the face of the Marielle I had loved, and of none other. The tides of time were frozen in their flowing, and all that was or had been or could be, all of the world that existed aside from her, became as fading shadows. And even as once before, was it eons or instants ago, my soul was locked in the marble hell of its supreme grief and regret. I could not move. I could not cry out, nor even weep, for my very tears were turned to ice. And now I knew with a terrible certitude that this one event, the death of the Lady Marielle, had drawn apart from all other happenings, had broken away from the sequence of time, and had found for itself a setting of appropriate gloom and solemnity. Or perhaps had even built around itself the whole enormous maze of that spectral city, in which to abide my destined return among the mists of a deceptive oblivion. At length, with an awful effort of will, I turned my eyes away, and leaving the cathedral with steps that were both hurried and leaden, I sought to find an egress from the dismal labyrinth of Malnéant to the gate by which I had entered. But this was by no means easy, and I must have roamed for hours in alleys blind and stifling as tombs, and along the tortuous, self-reverting thoroughfares, ere I came to a familiar street, and was able henceforward to direct my paces with something of surety. And a dull and sunless daylight was dawning behind the mists when I crossed the bridge and came again to the road that would lead me away from that fatal city. Since then, I have wandered long and in many places, but never again have I cared to revisit those old-world realms of fog and mist, for fear that I should come once more to Malnéant, and find that its people are still busied with their preparations for the obsequies of the Lady Marielle. The Colossus of Ylourgne. Chapter 1. The Flight of the Necromancer. The thrice infamous Satyr, alchemist, astrologer, and necromancer, with his 10 devil-given pupils, had departed very suddenly and under circumstances of strict secrecy from the town of Holiness. It was widely thought, among the people of that vicinage, that his departure had been prompted by a salutary fear of ecclesiastical thumbscrews and Other wizards, less notorious than he, had already gone to the stake during a year of unusual inquisitory zeal, and it was well known that Satyr had incurred the reprobation of the Church. Few, therefore, considered the reason of his going a mystery, but the means of transit which he had employed, as well as the destination of the sorcerer and his pupils, were regarded as more than problematic. 1,000 dark and superstitious rumors were abroad, and passers made the sign of the cross when they neared the tall, gloomy house which Nathair had built in blasphemous proximity to the great cathedral and had filled with a furniture of satanic luxury and strangeness. 2 daring thieves, who had entered the mansion when the fact of its desertion became well established, reported that much of this furniture, as well as the books and other paraphernalia of Nathair, had seemingly departed with its owner, doubtless to the same fiery bourne. This served to augment the unholy mystery, for it was patently impossible that Nathair and his 10 apprentices, with several cartloads of household belongings, could have passed the ever-guarded city gates in any legitimate manner without the knowledge of the custodians. It was said by the more devout and religious moiety that the arch-fiend, with a legion of bat-winged assistants, had borne them away bodily at moonless midnight. There were clerics and also reputable burghers, who professed to have seen the flight of man-like shapes upon the blotted stars together with others that were not men, and to have heard the wailing cries of the hell-bound crew as they passed in an evil cloud over the roofs and city walls. Others believed that the sorcerers had transported themselves from Viones through their own diabolic arts, and had withdrawn to some unfrequented fastness where Nathair, who had long been in feeble health, could hope to die in such peace and serenity as might be enjoyed by one who stood between the flames of the auto-da-fe and those of Abaddon. It was thought that he had lately cast his own horoscope, for the first time in his 50-odd years, and had read therein an impending conjunction of disastrous planets signifying early death. Others still, among whom were certain rival astrologers and enchanters, said that Nathair had retired from the public view merely that he might commune without interruption with various coadjutive demons, and thus might weave, unmolested, the black spells of a supreme and lycanthropic malice. These spells, they hinted, would in due time be visited upon Viones, and perhaps upon the entire region of Averoigne, and would no doubt take the form of a fearsome pestilence, or a wholesale invultuation, or a realm-wide incursion of succubi and incubi. Amid the seething of strange rumors, many half-forgotten tales were recalled, and new legends were created overnight. Much was made of the obscure nativity of Nathair and his dubitable wanderings before he had settled, 6 years previous, in Viones. People said that he was fiend-begotten, like the fabled Merlin, his father being no less a personage than Alastor, demon of revenge, and his mother, a deformed and dwarfish sorceress. From the former, he had taken his spitefulness and malignity, from the latter, his squat, puny physique. He had traveled in Orient lands, and had learned from Egyptian or Saracenic masters the unhallowed art of necromancy, in whose practice he was unrivaled. There were black whispers anent the use he had made of long-dead bodies, of fleshless bones, and the service he had wrung from buried men that the angel of doom alone could lawfully raise up. He had never been popular, though many had sought his advice and assistance in the furthering of their own more or less dubious affairs. Once, in the 3rd year after his coming to Viones, he had been stoned in public because of his bruited necromancies, and had been permanently lamed by a well-directed cobble. This injury, it was thought, he had never forgiven, and he was said to return the antagonism of the clergy with the hellish hatred of an antichrist. Apart from the sorcerous evils and abuses of which he was commonly suspected, he had long been looked upon as a corrupter of youth. Despite his minikin stature, his deformity and ugliness, he possessed a remarkable power, a mesmeric persuasion, and his pupils, whom he was said to have plunged into bottomless and ghoulish iniquities, were young men of the most brilliant promise. On the whole, his vanishment was regarded as a quite providential riddance. Among the people of the city, there was one man who took no part in the somber gossip and lurid speculation. This man was Gaspard du Nord, himself a student of the prescribed sciences, who had been numbered for a year among the pupils of Nathair, but had chosen to withdraw quietly from the master's household after learning the enormities that would attend his further initiation. He had, however, taken with him much rare and peculiar knowledge, together with a certain insight into the baleful powers and night-dark motives of the necromancer. Because of this knowledge and insight, Gaspard preferred to remain silent when he heard of Nathair's departure. Also, he did not think it well to revive the memory of his own past pupillage. Alone with his books, in a sparsely furnished attic, he frowned above a small, oblong mirror, framed with an arabesque of golden vipers that had once been the property of Nathaire. It was not the reflection of his own comely and youthful, though subtly lined face that caused him to frown. Indeed, the mirror was of another kind than that which reflects the features of the gazer. In its depths, for a few instants, he had beheld a strange and ominous-looking scene, whose participants were known to him, but whose location he could not recognize or orientate. Before he could study it closely, the mirror had clouded as if with the rising of alchemic fumes, and he had seen no more. This clouding, he reflected, could mean only one thing. Nathaire had known himself, watched, and had put forth a counterspell that rendered the clairvoyant mirror useless. It was the realization of this fact, together with the brief, sinister glimpse of Nathaire's present activities, that troubled Gaspar, and caused a chill horror to mount slowly in his mind, a horror that had not yet found a palpable form or a name. Chapter 2. The Gathering of the Dead. The departure of Nathaire and his pupils occurred in the late spring of 1281, during the interlunar dark. Afterwards, a new moon waxed above the flowery fields and bright-leafed woods, and waned in ghostly silver. With its waning, people began to talk of other magicians and fresher mysteries. Then, in the moon-deserted nights of early summer, there came a series of disappearances far more unnatural and inexplicable than that of the dwarfish, malignant sorcerer. It was found one day by gravediggers who had gone early to their toil in a cemetery outside the walls of Vaionis that no less than 6 newly occupied graves had been opened, and the bodies, which were those of reputable citizens, removed. On closer examination, it became all too evident that this removal had not been effected by robbers. The coffins, which lay aslant or stood protruding upright from the mold, offered all the appearance of having been shattered from within, as if by the use of extra-human strength, and the fresh earth itself was upheaved, as if the dead men, in some awful, untimely resurrection, had actually dug their way to the surface. The corpses had vanished utterly, as if hell had swallowed them, and as far as could be learned, there were no eyewitnesses of their fate. In those devil-ridden times, only one explanation of the happening seemed credible. Demons had entered the graves and had taken bodily possession of the dead, compelling them to arise and go forth. To the dismay and horror of all Averoigne, the strange vanishment was followed with appalling promptness by many others of a like sort. It seemed as if an occult, resistless summons had been laid upon the dead. Nightly, for a period of 2 weeks, the cemeteries of Vaionis and also those of other towns, of villages and hamlets, gave up a ghastly quota of their tenants. From brazen bolted tombs, from common charnels, from shallow unconsecrated trenches, from the marble-lidded vaults of churches and cathedrals, the weird exodus went on without cessation. Worse than this, if possible, there were newly ceramented corpses that leapt from their biers or catafalques, and disregarding the horrified watchers, ran with great bounds of automatic frenzy into the night, never to be seen again by those who lamented them. In every case, the missing bodies were those of young, stalwart men who had died but recently, and had met their death through violence or accident rather than wasting illness. Some were criminals who had paid the penalty of their misdeeds. Others were men-at-arms or constables slain in the execution of their duty. Knights who had died in tourney or personal combat were numbered among them, and many were the victims of the robber bands who infested Averoigne at that time. There were monks, merchants, nobles, yeomen, pages, priests, but none, in any case, who had passed the prime of life. The old and infirm, it seemed, were safe from the animating demons. The situation was looked upon by the more superstitious as a veritable omening of the world's end. Satan was making war with his cohorts and was carrying the bodies of the holy dead into hellish captivity. The consternation increased 100-fold when it became plain that even the most liberal sprinkling of holy water, the performance of the most awful and cogent exorcisms, failed utterly to give protection against this diabolic ravishment. The Church owned itself powerless to cope with the strange evil, and the forces of secular law could do nothing to arraign or punish the intangible agency. Because of the universal fear that prevailed, no effort was made to follow the missing cadavers. Ghastly tales, however, were told by late wayfarers who had met certain of these liches, striding alone or in companies along the roads of Averoigne. They gave the appearance of being deaf, dumb, totally insensate, and of hurrying with horrible speed and sureness towards a remote, predestined goal. The general direction of their flight, it seemed, was eastward, but only with the cessation of the exodus, which had numbered several hundred people, did anyone begin to suspect the actual destination of the dead. This destination, it somehow became rumored, was the ruinous castle of Ylourgne, beyond the werewolf-haunted forest, in the outlying, semi-mountainous hills of Averoigne. Ylourgne, a great craggy pile that had been built by a line of evil and marauding barons now extinct, was a place that even the goatherds preferred to shun. The wrathful specters of its bloody lords were said to move turbulently in its crumbling halls, and its chatelaines were the undead. No one cared to dwell in the shadow of its cliff-founded walls, and the nearest abode of living men was a small Cistercian monastery, more than a mile away on the opposite slope of the valley. The monks of this austere brotherhood held little commerce with the world beyond the hills, and few were the visitors who sought admission at their high-perched portals. But, during that dreadful summer, following the disappearances of the dead, a weird and disquieting tale went forth from the monastery throughout Averoigne. Beginning with late spring, the Cistercian monks were compelled to take cognizance of sundry odd phenomena in the old, long-deserted ruins of Ylourgne, which were visible from their windows. They had beheld flaring lights where lights should not have been, flames of uncanny blue and crimson that shuddered behind the broken, weed-grown embrasures or rose starwards above the jagged crenellations. Hideous noises had issued from the ruin by night together with the flames, and the monks had heard a clangor as of hellish anvils and hammers, a ringing of gigantic armor and maces, and had deemed that Ylourgne was become a mustering ground of devils. Mephitic odors as of brimstone and burning flesh had floated across the valley, and even by day, when the noises were silent and the lights no longer flared, a thin haze of hell-blue vapor hung upon the battlements. It was plain, the monks thought, that the place had been occupied from beneath by subterrestrial beings, for no one was seen to approach it by way of the bare, open slopes and crags. Observing these signs of the arch-foe's activity in their neighborhood, they crossed themselves with new fervor and frequency, and said their paters and aves more interminably than before. Their toil and austerities also they redoubled. Otherwise, since the old castle was a place abandoned by men, they took no heed of the supposed occupation, deeming it well to mind their own affairs unless in case of overt satanic hostility. They kept a careful watch, but for several weeks they saw no one who actually entered Ylourgne or emerged therefrom. Except for the nocturnal lights and noises and the hovering vapor by day, there was no proof of tenantry either human or diabolic. Then, one morning, in the valley below the terraced gardens of the monastery, two brothers, hoeing weeds in a carrot patch, beheld the passing of a singular train of people who came from the direction of the great forest of Averoigne and went upwards, climbing the steep, chasmy slope towards Ylourgne. These people, the monks averred, were striding along in great haste, with stiff but flying steps, and all were strangely pale of feature and were habited in the garments of the grave. The shrouds of some were torn and ragged, and all were dusty with travel or grimed with the mold of interment. The people numbered a dozen or more, and after them, at intervals, there came several stragglers, attired like the rest. With marvelous agility and speed, they mounted the hill and disappeared at length amid the lowering walls of Ylourgne. At this time, No rumor of the ravished graves and biers had reached the Cistercians. The tale was brought to them later, after they had beheld, on many successive mornings, the passing of small or great companies of the dead towards the devil-taken castle. Hundreds of these liches, they swore, had filed by beneath the monastery, and doubtless many others had gone past unnoted in the dark. None, however, were seen to come forth from Ylourgne, which had swallowed them up like the undisgorging pit. Though direly frightened and sorely scandalized, the brothers still thought it well to refrain from action. Some, the hardiest, irked by all these flagrant signs of evil, had desired to visit the ruins with holy water and lifted crucifixes, but their abbot, in his wisdom, enjoined them to wait. In the meanwhile, the nocturnal flames grew brighter, the noises louder. Also, in the course of this waiting, while incessant prayers went up from the little monastery, a frightful thing occurred. One of the brothers, a stout fellow named Théophile, in violation of the rigorous discipline, had made overfrequent visits to the wine casks. No doubt he had tried to drown his pious horror at these untoward happenings. At any rate, after his potations, he had the ill luck to wander out among the precipices and break his neck. Sorrowing for his death and dereliction, the brothers laid Théophile in the chapel and chanted their masses for his soul. These masses, in the dark hours before morning, were interrupted by the untimely resurrection of the dead monk, who, with his head lolling horribly on his broken neck, rushed as if fiend-ridden from the chapel, and ran down the hill towards the demon flames and clamors of Ylourgne. Chapter 3. The Testimony of the Monks. Following the above-related occurrence, two of the brothers who had previously desired to visit the haunted castle again applied to the abbot for this permission, saying that God would surely aid them in avenging the abduction of Théophile's body, as well as the taking of many others from consecrated ground. Marveling at the hardihood of these lusty monks, who proposed to beard the arch-enemy in his lair, the abbot permitted them to go forth, furnished with aspergilluses and flasks of holy water, and bearing great crosses of hornbeam, such as would have served for maces with which to brain an armored knight. The monks, whose names were Bernard and Stephan, went boldly up at middle forenoon to assail the evil stronghold. It was an arduous climb, among overhanging boulders and along slippery scarps, but both were stout and agile, and, moreover, well accustomed to such climbing. Since the day was sultry and airless, their white robes were soon stained with sweat. But pausing only for brief prayer, they pressed on, and in good season they neared the castle, upon whose gray, time-eroded ramparts they could still descry no evidence of occupation or activity. The deep moat that had once surrounded the place was now dry, and had been partly filled by crumbling earth and detritus from the walls. The drawbridge had rotted away, but the blocks of the barbican, collapsing into the moat, had made a sort of rough causey on which it was possible to cross. Not without trepidation, and lifting their crucifixes as warriors lift their weapons in the escalade of an armed fortress, the brothers climbed over the ruin of the barbican into the courtyard. This, too, like the battlements, was seemingly deserted. Overgrown nettles, rank grasses, and sapling trees were rooted between its paving stones. The high, massive donjon, the chapel, and that portion of the castellated structure containing the great hall had preserved their main outlines after centuries of dilapidation. To the left of the broad bailey, a doorway yawned like the mouth of a dark cavern in the cliffy mass of the hall building, and from this doorway there issued a thin, bluish vapor, writhing in phantom coils towards the unclouded heavens. Approaching the doorway, the brothers beheld a gleaming of red fires within, like the eyes of dragons blinking through infernal murk. They felt sure that the place was an outpost of Erebus, an antechamber of the pit. But nevertheless, they entered bravely, chanting loud exorcisms and brandishing their mighty crosses of hornbeam. Passing through the cavernous doorway, they could see but indistinctly in the gloom, being somewhat blinded by the summer sunlight they had left. Then, with the gradual clearing of their vision, a monstrous scene was limned before them, with ever-growing details of crowding horror and grotesquerie. Some of the details were obscure and mysteriously terrifying. Others, all too plain, were branded as if with sudden, ineffaceable hellfire on the minds of the monks. They stood on the threshold of a colossal chamber, which seemed to have been made by the tearing down of upper floors and inner partitions adjacent to the castle hall, itself a room of huge extent. The chamber seemed to recede through interminable shadow, shafted with sunlight falling through the rents of ruin, sunlight that was powerless to dissipate the infernal gloom and mystery. The monks averred later that they saw many people moving about the place, together with sundry demons, some of whom were shadowy and gigantic, and others barely to be distinguished from the men. These people, as well as their familiars, were occupied with the tending of reverberatory furnaces and immense pear-shaped and gourd-shaped vessels, such as were used in alchemy. Some, also, were stooping above great fuming cauldrons, like sorcerers, busy with the brewing of terrible drugs. Against the opposite wall, there were two enormous vats, built of stone and mortar, whose circular sides rose higher than a man's head, so that Bernard and Stéphane were unable to determine their contents. One of the vats gave forth a whitish glimmering, the other a ruddy luminosity. Near the vats, and somewhat between them, there stood a sort of low couch or litter, made of luxurious, weirdly figured fabrics, such as the Saracens weave. On this the monks discerned a dwarfish being, pale and wizened, with eyes of chill flame that shone like evil barrels through the dusk. The dwarf, who had all the air of a feeble moribund, was supervising the toils of the men and their familiars. The dazed eyes of the brothers began to comprehend other details. They saw that several corpses, among which they recognized that of Théophile, were lying on the middle floor, together with a heap of human bones that had been wrenched asunder at the joints, and great lumps of flesh piled like the carvings of butchers. One of the men was lifting the bones and dropping them into a cauldron beneath which there glowed a ruby-colored fire, and another was flinging the lumps of flesh into a tub filled with some hueless liquid that gave forth an evil hissing as of 1,000 serpents. Others had stripped the grave clothes from one of the cadavers, and were starting to assail it with long knives. Others still were mounting rude flights of stone stairs along the walls of the immense vats, carrying vessels filled with semi-liquescent matters which they emptied over the high rims. Appalled at this vision of human and satanic turpitude, and feeling a more than righteous indignation, the monks resumed their chanting of sonorous exorcisms and rushed forward. Their entrance, it appeared, was not perceived by the heinously occupied crew of sorcerers and devils. Bernard and Stéphane, filled with an ardor of godly wrath, were about to fling themselves upon the butchers who had started to assail the dead body. This corpse they recognized as being that of a notorious outlaw, named Jacques le Loup-Garou, who had been slain a few days previous in combat with the officers of the state. Le Loup-Garou, noted for his brawn, his cunning, and his ferocity, had long terrorized the woods and highways of Averoigne. His great body had been half eviscerated by the swords of the constabulary, and his beard was stiff and purple with the dried blood of a ghastly wound that had cloven his face from temple to mouth. He had died unshriven, but nevertheless, the monks were unwilling to see his helpless cadaver put to some unhallowed use beyond the surmise of Christians. The pale, malignant-looking dwarf had now perceived the brothers. They heard him cry out in a shrill, imperatory tone that rose above the ominous hiss of the cauldrons and the hoarse mutter of men and demons. They knew not his words, which were those of some outlandish tongue and sounded like an incantation. Instantly, as if in response to an order, two of the men turned from their unholy chemistry, and lifting copper basins filled with an unknown, fetid liquor, hurled the contents of these vessels in the faces of Bernard and Stéphane. The brothers were blinded by the stinging fluid, which bit their flesh as with many serpents' teeth, and they were overcome by the noxious fumes, so that their great crosses dropped from their hands and they both fell unconscious on the castle floor. Recovering anon their sight and their other senses, they found that their hands had been tied with heavy thongs of gut, so that they were now helpless and could no longer wield their crucifixes or the sprinklers of holy water which they carried. In this ignominious condition, they heard the voice of the evil dwarf, commanding them to arise. They obeyed, though clumsily and with difficulty, being denied the assistance of their hands. Bernard, who was still sick with the poisonous vapor he had inhaled, fell twice before he succeeded in standing erect, and his discomfiture was greeted with a cachinnation of foul, obscene laughter from the assembled sorcerers. Now, standing, the monks were taunted by the dwarf, who mocked and reviled them, with appalling blasphemies such as could be uttered only by a bondservant of Satan. At last, according to their sworn testimony, he said to them, "Return to your kennel, ye whelps of Ile de Booth, and take with you this message. They that came here, as many shall go forth as one." Then, in obedience to a dreadful formula spoken by the dwarf, two of the familiars, who had the shape of enormous and shadowy beasts, approached the body of Loup-Garou and that of Brother Théophile. One of the foul demons, like a vapor that sinks into a marsh, entered the bloody nostrils of Loup-Garou, disappearing inch by inch till its horned and bestial head was withdrawn from sight. The other, in like manner, went in through the nostrils of Brother Théophile, whose head lay weird athwart his shoulder on the broken neck. Then, when the demons had completed their possession, the bodies, in a fashion horrible to behold, were raised up from the castle floor, the one with raveled entrails hanging from its wide wounds, the other with a head that dropped forward loosely on its bosom. Then, animated by their devils, the cadavers took up the crosses of a hornbeam that had been dropped by Stéphane and Bernard, and using the crosses for bludgeons, they drove the monks in ignominious flight from the castle amid a loud, tempestuous howling of infernal laughter from the dwarf and his necromantic crew. And the nude corpse of Loup-Garou and the robed cadaver of Théophile followed them far on the chasm-riven slopes below Ylourgne, striking great blows with the crosses, so that the backs of the two Cistercians were become a mass of bloody bruises. After a defeat so signal and crushing, no more of the monks were emboldened to go up against Ylourgne. The whole monastery thereafter devoted itself to triple austerities, to quadrupled prayers, and awaiting the unknown will of God and the equally obscure machinations of the devil, maintained a pious faith that was somewhat tempered with trepidation. In time, through goatherds who visited the monks, the tale of Stéphane and Bernard went forth throughout Averoigne, adding to the grievous alarm that had been caused by the wholesale disappearance of the dead. No one knew what was really going on in the haunted castle, or what disposition had been made of the hundreds of migratory corpses, for the light thrown on their fate by the monk's story, though lurid and frightful, was all too inconclusive, and the message sent by the dwarf was somewhat cabalistic. Everyone felt, however, that some gigantic menace, some black, infernal enchantment, was being brewed within the ruinous walls. The malign, moribund dwarf was all too readily identified with the missing sorcerer, Nathaire, and his underlings, it was plain, were Nathaire's pupils. Chapter 4. The Going Forth of Gaspard du Nord. Alone in his attic chamber, Gaspard du Nord, student of alchemy and sorcery and quondam pupil of Nathaire, sought repeatedly, but always in vain, to consult the viper-circled mirror. The glass remained obscure and cloudy, as with the risen fumes of satanical alembics or baleful necromantic braziers. Haggard and weary with long nights of watching, Gaspard knew that Nathaire was even more vigilant than he. Reading with anxious care the general configuration of the stars, he found the foretokening of a great evil that was to come upon Averoigne. But the nature of the evil was not clearly shown. In the meanwhile, the hideous resurrection and migration of the dead was taking place. All Averoigne shuddered at the manifold enormity. Like the timeless night of a Memphian plague, terror settled everywhere, and people spoke of each new atrocity in bated whispers, without daring to voice the execrable tale aloud. To Gaspard, as to everyone, the whispers came. And likewise, after the horror had apparently ceased in early midsummer, there came the appalling story of the Cistercian monks. Now, at last, the long-baffled watcher found an inkling of that which he sought. The hiding place of the fugitive necromancer and his apprentices at least had been uncovered, and the disappearing dead were clearly traced to their bourne. But still, even for the percipient Gaspard, there remained an undeclared enigma. The exact nature of the abominable brew, the hell-dark sorcery that Nathaire was concocting in his remote den. Gaspard felt sure of one thing only: the dying, splenetic dwarf, knowing that his allotted time was short, and hating the people of Averoigne with a bottomless rancor, would prepare an enormous and maleficent magic without parallel. Even with his knowledge of Nathaire's proclivities and his awareness of the well-nigh inexhaustible arcanic science, the reserves of pit-deep wizardry possessed by the dwarf, he could form only vague, terrifical conjectures anent the incubated evil. But, as time went on, he felt an ever-deepening oppression, the adumbration of a monstrous menace crawling from the dark rim of the world. He could not shake off his disquietude, and finally he resolved, despite the obvious perils of such an excursion, to pay a secret visit to the neighborhood of Ylourgne. Gaspard, though he came of a well-to-do family, was at that time in straitened circumstances, for his devotion to a somewhat doubtful science had been disapproved by his father. His sole income was a small pittance, purveyed secretly to the youth by his mother and sister. This sufficed for his meager food, the rent of his room, and a few books and instruments and chemicals. But it would not permit the purchase of a horse or even a humble mule for the proposed journey of more than 40 miles. Undaunted, he set forth on foot, carrying only a dagger and a wallet of food. He timed his wanderings so that he would reach Ylourgne at nightfall in the rising of a full moon. Much of his journey lay through the great, lowering forest, which approached the very walls of Vyonnes on the eastern side, and ran in a somber arc through Averoigne to the mouth of the rocky valley below Ylourgne. After a few miles, he emerged from the mighty wood of pines and oaks and larches, and thenceforward, for the first day, followed the river Isuel through an open, well-peopled plain. He spent the warm summer night beneath a beech tree, in the vicinity of a small village, not caring to sleep in the lonely woods where robbers and wolves, and creatures of a more baleful repute, were commonly supposed to dwell. At evening of the second day, after passing through the wildest and oldest portion of the immemorial wood, he came to the steep, stony valley that led to his destination. This valley was the fountainhead of the Isuel, which had dwindled to a mere rivulet. In the brown twilight, between sunset and moonrise, he saw the lights of the Cistercian monastery, and opposite, on the piled, forbidding scarps, the grim and rugged mass of the ruinous stronghold of Ylourgne, with wan and wizard fires flickering behind its high embrasures. Apart from these fires, there was no sign of occupation, and he did not hear at any time the dismal noises reported by the monks. Gaspard waited till the round moon, yellow as the eye of some immense nocturnal bird, had begun to peer above the darkling valley. Then, very cautiously, since the neighborhood was strange to him, he started to make his way towards the somber, brooding castle. Even for one well used to such climbing, the escalade would have offered enough difficulty and danger by moonlight. Several times, finding himself at the bottom of a sheer cliff, he was compelled to retrace his hard-won progress, and often he was saved from falling only by stunted shrubs and briars that had taken root in the niggard soil. Breathless, with torn raiment and scored and bleeding hands, he gained at length the shoulder of the craggy height below the walls. Here he paused to recover breath and recuperate his flagging strength. He could see from his vantage the pale reflection as of hidden flames that beat upwards on the inner walls of the high-built donjon. He heard a low hum of confused noises, whose distance and direction were alike baffling. Sometimes they seemed to float downwards from the black battlements, sometimes to issue from subterranean depths far in the hill. Apart from this remote, ambiguous hum, the night was locked in a mortal stillness. The very winds appeared to shun the vicinity of the dread castle. An unseen, clammy cloud of paralyzing evil hung removeless upon all things, and the pale, swollen moon, the patroness of witches and sorcerers, distilled her green poison above the crumbling towers in a silence older than time. Gaspard felt the obscenely clinging weight of a more burdenous thing than his own fatigue when he resumed his progress towards the barbican. Invisible webs of the waiting, ever-gathering evil seemed to impede him. The slow, noisome flapping of intangible wings was heavy in his face. He seemed to breathe a surging wind from unfathomable vaults and caverns of corruption. Inaudible howlings, derisive or minatory, thronged in his ears, and foul hands appeared to thrust him back. But, bowing his head as if against a blowing gale, he went on and climbed the mounded ruin of the barbican into the weedy courtyard. The place was deserted, to all seeming, and much of it was still deep in the shadows of the walls and turrets. Nearby, in the black, silver crenellated pile, Gaspard saw the open, cavernous doorway described by the monks. It was lit from within by a lurid glare, wannish and eerie as marsh fires. The humming noise, now audible as a muttering of voices, issued from the doorway, and Gaspard thought that he could see dark, sooty figures moving rapidly in the lit interior. Keeping in the farther shadows, he stole along the courtyard, making a sort of circuit amid the ruins. He did not dare to approach the open entrance for fear of being seen, though, as far as he could tell, the place was unguarded. He came to the donjon, on whose upper wall the wan light flickered obliquely through a sort of rift in the long building adjacent. This opening was at some distance from the ground, and Gaspard saw that it had been formerly the door to a stony balcony. A flight of broken steps led upwards along the wall to the half-crumbled remnant of this balcony, and it occurred to the youth that he might climb the steps and peer unobserved into the interior of Ylourgne. Some of the stairs were missing, and all were in heavy shadow. Gaspard found his way precariously to the balcony, pausing once in considerable alarm when a fragment of the worn stone, loosened by his footfall, dropped with a loud clattering on the courtyard flags below. Apparently, it was unheard by the occupants of the castle, and after a little, he resumed his climbing. Cautiously, he neared the large, ragged opening through which the light poured upwards. Crouching on a narrow ledge, which was all that remained of the balcony, he peered in on a most astounding and terrific spectacle, whose details were so bewildering that he could barely comprehend their import till after many minutes. It was plain that the story told by the monks, allowing for their religious bias, had been far from extravagant. Almost the whole interior of the half-ruined pile had been torn down and dismantled to afford room for the activities of Nether. This demolition in itself was a superhuman task for whose execution the sorcerer must have employed a legion of familiars as well as his 10 pupils. The vast chamber was fitfully illumined by the glare of athanors and braziers, and above all, by the weird glimmering from the huge stone vats. Even from his high vantage, the watcher could not see the contents of these vats, but a white luminosity poured upwards from the rim of one of them, and a flesh-tinted phosphorescence from the other. Gaspard had seen certain of the experiments and evocations of Nether, and was all too familiar with the appurtenances of the dark arts. Within certain limits, he was not squeamish, nor was it likely that he would have been terrified overmuch by the shadowy, uncouth shapes of demons who toiled in the pit below him side by side with the black-clad pupils of the sorcerer. But a cold horror clutched his heart when he saw the incredible, enormous thing that occupied the central floor. The colossal human skeleton 100 feet in length, stretching for more than the extent of the old castle hall. The skeleton whose bony right foot, the group of men and devils to all appearance, were busily clothing with human flesh. The prodigious and macabre framework, complete in every part, with ribs like arches of some satanic nave, shone as if it were still heated by the fires of an infernal welding. It seemed to shimmer and burn with unnatural life, to quiver with malign disquietude in the flickering glare and gloom. The great finger bones, curving claw-like on the floor, appeared as if they were about to close upon some helpless prey. The tremendous teeth were set in an everlasting grin of sardonic cruelty and malice. The hollow eye sockets, deep as Tartarian wells, appeared to seethe with myriad mocking lights, like the eyes of elementals swimming upwards in obscene shadow. Gaspar was stunned by the shocking and stupendous phantasmagoria that yawned before him like a peopled hell. Afterwards, he was never wholly sure of certain things, and could remember very little of the actual manner in which the work of the men and their assistants was being carried on. Dim, dubious, bat-like creatures seemed to be flitting to and fro between one of the stone vats and the group that toiled like sculptors, clothing the bony foot with a reddish plasm which they applied and molded like so much clay. Gaspard thought, but was not certain later, that this plasm, which gleamed as if with mingled blood and fire, was being brought from the rosy-litten vat in vessels borne by the claws of the shadowy flying creatures. None of them, however, approached the other vat, whose wannish light was momently enfeebled, as if it were dying down. He looked for the minikin figure of Nathaire, whom he could not distinguish in the crowded scene. The sick necromancer, if he had not already succumbed to the little-known disease that had long wasted him like an inward flame, was no doubt hidden from view by the colossal skeleton and was perhaps directing the labors of the men and demons from his couch. Spellbound on that precarious ledge, the watcher failed to hear the furtive, cat-like feet that were climbing behind him on the ruinous stairs. Too late. He heard the clink of a loose fragment close upon his heels, and turning in startlement, he toppled into sheer oblivion beneath the impact of a cudgel-like blow, and did not even know that the beginning fall of his body towards the courtyard had been arrested by his assailant's arms. Chapter 5. The Horror of Ylourgne. Gaspard, returning from his dark plunge into Lethian emptiness, found himself gazing into the eyes of Nathaire. Those eyes of liquid night and ebony, in which swam the chill, malignant fires of stars that had gone down to irremeable perdition. For some time, in the confusion of his senses, he could see nothing but the eyes, which seemed to have drawn him forth like baleful magnets from his swoon. Apparently disembodied or set in a face too vast for human cognizance, they burned before him in chaotic murk. Then, by degrees, he saw the other features of the sorcerer and the details of a lurid scene, and became aware of his own situation. Trying to lift his hands to his aching head, he found that they were bound tightly together at the wrists. He was half lying, half leaning against an object with hard planes and edges that irked his back. This object he discovered to be a sort of alchemic furnace, or athanor, part of a litter of disused apparatus that stood or lay on the castle floor. Cupels, aludels, cucurbits, like enormous gourds and globes, were mingled in strange confusion with the piled, iron-clasped books and the sooty cauldrons and braziers of a darker science. Nathaire, propped among Saracenic cushions with arabesques of sullen gold and fulgurant scarlet, was peering upon him from a kind of improvised couch made with bales of orient rugs and arrases, to whose luxury the rude walls of the castle, stained with mold and mottled with dead fungi, offered a grotesque foil. Dim lights and evilly swooping shadows flickered across the scene, and Gaspar could hear a guttural hum of voices behind him. Twisting his head a little, he saw one of the stone vats, whose rosy luminosity was blurred and blotted by vampire wings that went to and fro. "Welcome," said Nathaire, after an interval in which the student began to perceive the fatal progress of illness in the pain-pinched features before him. "So Gaspard du Nord has come to see his former master." The harsh, imperatory voice, with demoniac volume, issued appallingly from the wizened frame. "I have come," said Gaspard, in laconic echo. "Tell me, what devil's work is this in which I find you engaged? And what have you done with the dead bodies that were stolen by your accursed familiars?" The frail, dying body of Nathaire, as if possessed by some sardonic fiend, rocked to and fro on the luxurious couch in a long, violent gust of laughter, without other reply. "If your looks bear creditable witness," said Gaspar, when the baleful laughter had ceased, "you are mortally ill, and the time is short in which you can hope to atone for your deeds of malice and make your peace with God, if indeed it still be possible for you to make peace. What foul and monstrous brew are you preparing? to ensure the ultimate perdition of your soul." The dwarf was again seized by a spasm of diabolic mirth. "Nay, nay, my good Gaspar," he said finally. "I have made another bond than the one with which puling cowards try to purchase the goodwill and forgiveness of the heavenly tyrant. Hell may take me in the end, if it will. But hell has paid, and will still pay, an ample and goodly price. I must die soon, it is true, for my doom is written in the stars. But in death, by the grace of Satan, I live again, and shall go forth endowed with the mighty thews of the Anakim, to visit vengeance on the people of Averoigne, who have long hated me for my necromantic wisdom, and have held me in derision for my dwarf stature." "What madness is this whereof you dream?" asked the youth, appalled by the more than human frenzy and malignity that seemed to dilate the shrunken frame of Nathair and stream in Tartarian luster from his eyes. "It is no madness, but a veritable thing. A miracle, mayhap, as life itself is a miracle. From the fresh bodies of the dead, which otherwise would have rotted away in charnel foulness, my pupils and familiars are making for me, beneath my instruction, the giant form whose skeleton you have beheld. My soul, at the death of its present body, will pass into this colossal tenement through the working of certain spells of transmigration in which my faithful assistants have also been carefully instructed. If you had remained with me, Gaspar, and had not drawn back in your petty, pious squeamishness from the marvels and profundities that I should have unveiled for you, it would now be your privilege to share in the creation of this prodigy. And if you had come to Ylourgne a little sooner in your presumptuous prying, I might have made a certain use of your stout bones and muscles, the same use I have made of other young men who died through accident or violence. But it is too late even for this, since the building of the bones has been completed, and it remains only to invest them with human flesh. My good Gaspard, there is nothing whatever to be done with you, except to put you safely out of the way. Providentially, for this purpose, there is an oubliette beneath the castle, a somewhat dismal lodging place, no doubt, but one that was made strong and deep by the grim lords of Ylourgne." Gaspar was unable to frame any reply to this sinister and extraordinary speech. Searching his horror-frozen brain for words, he felt himself seized from behind by the hands of unseen beings who had come, no doubt, in answer to some gesture of Nathair, a gesture which the captive had not perceived. He was blindfolded with some heavy fabric, mouldy and musty as a gravecloth, and was led stumbling through the litter of strange apparatus and down a winding flight of ruinous narrow stairs from which the noisome breath of stagnating water, mingled with the oily muskiness of serpents, arose to meet him. He appeared to descend for a distance that would admit of no return. Slowly, the stench grew stronger, more insupportable. The stairs ended. A door clanged sullenly on rusty hinges, and Gaspar was thrust forward on a damp, uneven floor that seemed to have been worn away by myriad feet. He heard the grating of a ponderous slab of stone. His wrists were untied, the bandage was removed from his eyes, and he saw by the light of flickering torches a round hole that yawned in the oozing floor at his feet. Beside it was the lifted slab that had formed its lid. Before he could turn to see the faces of his captors, to learn if they were men or devils, he was seized rudely and thrust into the gaping hole. He fell through Erebus-like darkness for what seemed an immense distance before he struck bottom. Lying half-stunned in a shallow, fetid pool, he heard the funereal thud of the heavy slab as it slid back into place far above him. Chapter 6. The Vaults of Ylourgne. Gaspard was revived, after a while, by the chillness of the water in which he lay. His garments were half-soaked, and the slimy mephitic pool, as he discovered by his first movement, was within an inch of his mouth. He could hear a steady, monotonous dripping somewhere in the rayless night of his dungeon. He staggered to his feet, finding that his bones were still intact, and began a cautious exploration. Foul drops fell upon his hair and lifted face as he moved. His feet slipped and splashed in the rotten water, There were angry, vehement hissings, and serpentine coils slithered coldly across his ankles. He soon came to a rough wall of stone, and following the wall with his fingertips, he tried to determine the extent of the oubliette. The place was more or less circular, without corners, and he failed to form any just idea of its circuit. Somewhere in his wanderings, he found a shelving pile of rubble that rose above the water against the wall, and here, for the sake of comparative dryness and comfort, he ensconced himself, after dispossessing a number of outraged reptiles. These creatures, it seemed, were inoffensive, and probably belonged to some species of water snake, but he shivered at the touch of their clammy scales. Sitting on the rubble heap, Gaspard reviewed in his mind the various horrors of a situation that was infinitely dismal and desperate. He had learned the incredible, soul-shaking secret of Ylourgne, the unimaginably monstrous and blasphemous project of Nathaire. But now, immured in this noisome hole as in a subterranean tomb, in depths beneath the devil-haunted pile, he could not even warn the world of imminent menace. The wallet of food, now more than half empty, with which he had started from Vionnes, was still hanging at his back, and he assured himself by investigation that his captors had not troubled to deprive him of his dagger. Gnawing a crust of stale bread in the darkness and caressing with his hand the hilt of the precious weapon, he sought for some rift in the all-environing despair. He had no means of measuring the black hours that went over him with the slowness of a slime-clogged river, crawling in blind silence to a subterranean sea. The ceaseless drip of water, probably from sunken hill springs that had supplied the castle in former years alone, broke the stillness, but the sound became in time an equivocal monotone that suggested to his half-delirious mind the mirthless and perpetual chuckling of unseen imps. At last, from sheer bodily exhaustion, he fell into troubled, nightmare-ridden chamber. He could not tell if it were night or noon in the world without when he awakened, for the same stagnant darkness, unrelieved by ray or glimmer, brimmed the oubliette. Shivering, he became aware of a steady draught that blew upon him, a dank, unwholesome air, like the breath of unsunned vaults that had wakened into cryptic life and activity during his sleep. He had not noticed the draught heretofore, and his numb brain was startled into sudden hope by the intimation which it conveyed. Obviously, there was some underground rift or channel through which the air entered, and this rift might somehow prove to be a place of egress from the oubliette. Getting to his feet, he groped uncertainly forward in the direction of the draught. He stumbled over something that cracked and broke beneath his heels, and narrowly checked himself from falling on his face into slimy, serpent-haunted pool. Before he could investigate the obstruction or resume his blind groping, he heard a harsh, grating noise above, and a wavering shaft of yellow light came down through the oubliette's open mouth. Dazzled, he looked up, and saw the round hole 10 or 12 feet overhead, through which a dark hand had reached down with a flaring torch. A small basket, containing a loaf of coarse bread and a bottle of wine, was being lowered at the end of a cord. Gaspard took the bread and wine, and the basket was drawn up. Before the withdrawal of the torch and the redepositing of the slab, he contrived to make a hasty survey of his dungeon. The place was roughly circular, as he had surmised, and was perhaps 15 feet in diameter. The thing over which he had stumbled was a human skeleton, lying half on the rubble heap, half in the filthy water. It was brown and rotten with age, and its garments had long melted away in patches of liquid mold. The walls were guttered and runneled by centuries of ooze, and their very stone, it seemed, was rotting slowly to decay. In the opposite side, at the bottom, he saw the opening he had suspected. A low mouth, not much bigger than a fox's hole, into which the sluggish water flowed. His heart sank at the sight, for even if the water were deeper than it seemed, the hole was far too straight for the passage of a man's body. In a state of hopelessness that was like a veritable suffocation, he found his way back to the rubble pile when the light had been withdrawn. The loaf of bread and the bottle of wine were still in his hands. Mechanically, with dull, sodden hunger, he munched and drank. Afterwards he felt stronger, and the sour common wine served to warm him and perhaps help to inspire him with the idea which he presently conceived. Finishing the bottle, he found his way across the dungeon to the low, burrow-like hole. The entering air current had strengthened, and this he took for a good omen. Drawing his dagger, he started to pick with the point at the half-rotten, decomposing wall in an effort to enlarge the opening. He was forced to kneel in noisome silt, and the writhing coils of water snakes, hissing frightfully, crawled across his legs as he worked. Evidently the hole was their means of ingress and egress, to and from the oubliette. The stone crumbled readily beneath his dagger, and Gaspard forgot the horror and ghastliness of his situation in the hope of escape. He had no means of knowing the thickness of the wall, or the nature and extent of the subterranes that lay beyond, but he felt sure that there was some channel of connection with the outer air. For hours or days, it seemed, he toiled with his dagger, digging blindly at the soft wall and removing the debris that splashed in the water beside him. After a while, prone on his belly, he crept into the hole he had enlarged, and, burrowing like some laborious mole, he made his way onwards, inch by inch. At last, to his prodigious relief, the dagger point went through into empty space. He broke away with his hands the thin shell of obstructing stone that remained. Then, crawling on in the darkness, he found that he could stand upright on a sort of shelving floor. Straightening his cramped limbs, he moved on very cautiously. He was in a narrow vault or tunnel, whose sides he could touch simultaneously with his outstretched fingertips. The floor was a downwards incline, and the water deepened, rising to his knees and then to his waist. Probably the place had once been used as an underground exit from the castle, and the roof, falling in, had dammed the water. More than a little dismayed, Gaspard began to wonder if he had exchanged the foul, skeleton-haunted oubliette for something even worse. The night around and before him was still untouched by any ray, and the air current, though strong, was laden with dankness and moldiness as of interminable vaults. Touching the tunnel sides at intervals as he plunged hesitantly into the deepening water, he found a sharp angle, giving upon free space at his right. The space proved to be the mouth of an intersecting passage, whose flooded bottom was at least level and went no deeper into the stagnant foulness. Exploring it, he stumbled over the beginning of a flight of upward steps. Mounting these through the shoaling water, he soon found himself on dry stone. The stairs, narrow, broken, irregular, without landings, appeared to wind in some eternal spiral that was coiled lightlessly about the bowels of Ylourgne. They were close and stifling as a tomb, and plainly they were not the source of the air current which Gaspard had started to follow. Whither they would lead, he knew not, nor could he tell if they were the same stairs by which he had been conducted to his dungeon. But he climbed steadily, pausing only at long intervals to regain his breath as best he could in the dead, mephitis-burdened air. At length, in the solid darkness, far above, he began to hear a mysterious, muffled sound, a dull but recurrent crash as of mighty blocks and masses of falling stone. The sound was unspeakably ominous and dismal, and it seemed to shake the unfathomable walls around Gaspard, and to thrill with a sinister vibration in the steps on which he trod. He climbed now with redoubled caution and alertness, stopping ever and anon to listen. The recurrent crashing noise grew louder, more ominous, as if it were immediately above, and the listener crouched on the dark stairs for a time that might have been many minutes, without daring to go farther. At last, with disconcerting suddenness, the sound came to an end, leaving a strained and fearful stillness. With many baleful conjectures, not knowing what fresh enormity he should find, Gaspard ventured to resume his climbing. Again, in the blank and solid stillness, he was met by a sound, the dim, reverberant chanting of voices, as in some satanic mass or liturgy with dirge-like cadences that turned to intolerably soaring paeans of evil triumph. Long before he could recognize the words, he shivered at the strong, malefic throbbing of the measured rhythm, whose fall and rise appeared somehow to correspond to the heartbeats of some colossal demon. The stairs turned, for the 100th time in their tortuous spiral, and coming forth from that long midnight, Gaspard blinked in the wan glimmering that streamed towards him from above. The choral voices met him in a more sonorous burst of infernal sound, and he knew the words for those of a rare and potent incantation, used by sorcerers for a supremely foul, supremely maleficent purpose. Affrightedly, as he climbed the last steps, he knew the thing that was taking place amid the ruins of Ylourgne. Lifting his head warily above the castle floor, he saw that the stairs ended in a far corner of the vast room in which he had beheld Nathair's unthinkable creation. The whole extent of the internally dismantled building lay before him, filled with a weird glare in which the beams of the slightly gibbous moon were mingled with the ruddy flames of dying Athenors and the coiling, multicolored tongues that rose from necromantic braziers. Gaspard, for an instant, was puzzled by the flood of full moonlight amid the ruins. Then he saw that almost the whole inner wall of the castle, giving on the courtyard, had been removed. It was the tearing down of the prodigious blocks, no doubt through an extra-human labor levied by sorcery, that he had heard during his ascent from the subterranean vaults.